This building is the Marco Hatfield US District Courthouse, and this is what has been taking place over the last 60 days. Those clips were taken from a 9-minute video of a US congressional hearing of Attorney General William Barr. This was in response to media calls that what had been taking place was entirely peaceful protests.
It is not, generally speaking, unruly.
Peaceful protest.
Peaceful protesters.
Peaceful protest.
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 Peaceful protest. Peaceful protest.
Peaceful protest.
Peaceful protest.
This line of thinking continued with the Democratic representatives present at the meeting.
Most of them are non-violent.
In Portland, we've seen mothers and we've seen veterans who were peacefully protesting, not threatening the federal courthouse, beaten and gassed.
Including tear-gassing elderly, nonviolent Americans. The protesters aren't mobs. They are mothers and veterans and mayors.
It is true. There's violence across the whole country. Do you disavow the violence from Antifa? That's happening in Portland right now? There's riots.
That's a myth that's being spread only in Washington, D.C.
About Antifa in Portland?
Yes.
Sir, there's videos everywhere online. There's fires and riots.
To prove that the protests were peaceful and that the violence was a myth, the Democrats played a video in which they showed peaceful protesters chanting and singing. Now, I hope I don't have to explain why a slideshow of peaceful protests versus video evidence of the protests turning violent is not convincing enough to negate describing the protests as violent or riots. Even if your protest is about the most moral thing possible, when it descends into a riot and violence, it is no longer legitimate. And the police force have not only a right, but a duty to dismantle the protest and restore order so that peaceful protests can continue. The next argument the Democrats made was that by deploying federal officers to protect the federal courthouse, William Barr was making the situation worse.
In most of these cities, the protests had begun to wind down before you marched in and confronted the protesters.
But the governor of Oregon and the mayor of Portland has asked that the federal troops leave because the reaction has actually been in reverse proportion. People are showing up because the troops are there.
If you tell them they can't throw acid in the faces of unveiled women in Karachi, they will be annoyed with you. If you say, we insist, we think that cartoonists in Copenhagen can print satire on the Prophet Muhammad, you've just made an enemy. You've brought it on.
Thankfully, William Barr absolutely destroys this argument.
The fact of the matter is, if you take Portland, the courthouse is under attack. The federal resources are inside the perimeter around the courthouse, defending it from almost 2 months of daily attacks where people march to the court, try to gain entrance, and have set fires, thrown things, used explosives, and injured police, including just this past weekend, perhaps permanently blinding 3 federal officers with lasers. We are on the defense. We're not out looking for trouble. And if the state and the city would provide the law enforcement services that other jurisdictions do, we would have no need to have additional marshals in the courthouse.
To get a visual understanding of what's happening on the ground, I took some Google View screenshots. This one shows the courthouse, and even in 2019, apparently there was a protester outside. Next to the courthouse, you have the Portland Police Bureau, a county jail and other law enforcement operations, which is likely the reason that this quarter has turned into a war zone. And one thing people need to understand is the federal officers have a duty to defend federal property under attack.
Is being burned by essentially improvised explosive device, being blinded by lasers, is this something that typically happens with federal marshals in federal courthouses?
No, not at all. These are people who this Congress has charged with protecting federal courts. They're directed to protect federal courts in the U.S. Code, and they are under attack.
And the courthouse still functions every single day.
61 nights in a row, they defend against a siege, fires, burning down these things. You know what's the most amazing thing? They get up every morning and that courthouse is still running. They're still conducting the federal government's business. They do this every single night. Are they getting sleep?
The marshals are having a difficult time because their demonstrators go to the hotel. They also go from hotel to hotel because the demonstrators try to disrupt their sleep at the hotel.
So the obvious question is, how do we end this situation after 60 days? Well, the Democrats have an answer.
In this moment, real leadership would entail de-escalation, collaboration, and looking for ways to peaceably resolve our differences.
Why would we have to negotiate a ceasefire with a peaceful protest?